This is like speeding? My God.
It is every cop's nightmare. They respond to a call and don't know who or what is waiting for them when they arrive. Years of training will be tested in a split second.
Stop! Stop!
The armed suspect is gunned down in a blaze of bullets. Only this time, there's no blood, no body bags, no chalked outline of a corpse. This is a modern-day high-tech firing range, a simulator that combines all of the lights, camera, and action of a Hollywood movie.
For the law enforcement community, the most important aspect of it is the realism, the interactivity, and the ability to create scenarios that they may face in their day-to-day job.
Anything better to do than stop us on a Sunday morning?
Just need to see the lady's driver's license. Just relax.
Using actors, real-life scenes are videotaped, transferred to CDs, and then projected on a large video screen. Computer hardware and software control the scenarios, so they can be programmed for the suspect to respond in many different ways. They can lay down their weapon or fire back.
Hold it! Stop!
Officers use training weapons that have been modified to fire laser beams. They look, feel, even sound like the real thing.
We use a crack and thump sound methodology where the trainee can actually hear the crack of the round and the thump that he would hear as the sound waves travel to him from the distance of where the target is simulated.
One of the leaders in simulator firing ranges is a Georgia-based company known as FATS, which stands for Firearms Training Systems.
There's something over 4,000 FATS simulators in use today in 52 countries. And along with those simulators are approximately 40,000 simulation weapons.
But not all simulators use laser weapons and video screens. Some simulators use paper movie screens, making it possible for shooters to use real bullets.
Some of the special forces units may be more inclined to use live fire. With projected image targets, the targets that can be used are really only limited by imagination.
That's a concept that would stagger the imagination of frontiersmen who used to take target practice by shooting at a mark on a tree. Using a tree as a target was more humane than some of the target practice that took place in ancient times. Homer's Iliad refers to Greeks refining their skills with a bow and arrow by practicing shooting real pigeons resting on tall poles. 14th century Austria was the scene of one of the most legendary displays of marksmanship and target practice. It involved an apple, an arrow, a little boy, and his father, whose name was William Tell. Tell was ordered to shoot an apple from his son's head by a ruthless local ruler named Gessler, as punishment for Tell not kneeling at the sight of the ruler's hat. Tell succeeded, but that wasn't the last time Gessler witnessed Tell's amazing marksmanship. Tell later slew Gessler with a single arrow through the heart. Fortunately, by the 16th century, target practice had become much more civilized and gave rise to sports shooting clubs in Germany. Members participated in one-shot matches and fired at elaborately painted wooden targets. As rifles and pistols gained popularity in Europe and America, most firing ranges were simply the great outdoors. Any place a shooter could set up some glass plates, bottles, a tin can, or a piece of wood with a bullseye painted on it.
Some of the early targets were simple bullseye targets printed on inexpensive paper. Sometimes there were targets, silhouettes of game animals, birds, rabbits.
Some preferred shooting at playing cards, like legendary Buffalo Bill Cody, who would show off his shooting skills at exhibitions staged all over the world. Glass balls filled with feathers was the target of choice for famed exhibition shooter Annie Oakley. By the early 1900s, expensive glass balls in china plates were replaced with the return of paper targets made of inexpensive newsprint. Easy to mount and able to take dozens of shots before needing to be thrown away, They were the perfect targets for police departments who needed a cheap way to train their expanding forces to fight crime.
In the early 1900s, firing ranges were primarily sticks in the ground where the shooter would put a target on a stick or perhaps a tree or on a fence post and then walk a distance back and shoot at it. Very rudimentary, very unsophisticated. Military ranges were a little bit more sophisticated in that generally there would be a post or a camp where soldiers would train in the use of their firearms, and they would have a berm or a large mountain or hillside to shoot into, and then they would line up their targets in a row and then have a known distance from which they would shoot.
During World War I, the U.S. military experimented with a firing range of a very different kind. The House of Horror. It was used to train soldiers in the dangerous art of entering an occupied building.
They would find an abandoned building or warehouse, then they would dress up targets with dummies, enemy uniforms, friendly uniforms. They'd pull open doors, have a curtain that the shooter would have to go through, release a cable, and the target would flop out toward the shooter.
Most soldiers, however, sharpened their shooting eye on paper target ranges, which earned high marks for effectiveness, but low marks for efficiency.
You waited till everyone was through firing before you'd go down range, hang your targets. Shooters would then go back to the line, do a little bit of shooting, call a ceasefire, walk back down, change targets.
Some shooters were wounded or even killed by accidental gunfire while retrieving their targets. But that all changed in the early 1920s, thanks to this man.
Colonel Arthur Caswell was a retired military officer who got involved with the shooting ranges and with law enforcement training. And one of the first things he did was invent a target retrieval system. The target was suspended by a cable that was attached to pulleys on both ends. The shooter would run the pulley system from one end to the other to move the target downrange. The target was moved up and down with a hand crank that the officer or the shooter would actually turn himself or herself.
In 1926, Colonel Caswell set up a company to design and build firing ranges. And now that he had made target retrieval easier and safer, more and more indoor firing ranges were being built. But these ranges had to find answers to a potentially deadly problem: how to stop a speeding bullet.
As ranges became more sophisticated over time, there was introduced the notion of a bullet trap, or a device by which bullets could be discharged safely indoors and then captured or terminated without danger to the shooter.
Drawing inspiration from the centuries-old practice of setting up outdoor firing ranges in front of hillsides, many early indoor ranges built hills of sand to trap bullets.
A couple of feet deep of fairly coarse sand makes a viable bullet trap.
Viable until thousands of bullets hitting the same spot pile up on each other, creating dangerous hotspots.
Now you run the risk of bullets hitting that mass and not being absorbed and stopped in the sand, but bouncing back and creating a hazard on the range.
Then came the idea of combining sand and steel to trap bullets.
It became known as a plate and pit. And essentially what was used was a piece of steel or armor plate mounted at an angle so that the bullet would strike the plate and deflect into a pit down below, which was full of sand.
But not all bullets reached the sand. Sometimes whole bullets or even fragments would ricochet off the steel and strike the shooter. So the quest continued to build a better bullet trap, one that would catch the bullet whole and reduce the danger of ricochet. In the 1980s, Caswell International started making rubber bullet traps. They tried everything: rubber blocks, strips of rubber, and tiny chunks of rubber known as granular rubber bullet traps.
One of the simplest is to take usually shredded or chopped up pieces of used tires and layer them on some kind of a support structure and layer them a couple of feet thick. The rubber absorbs the energy of the bullet, slows it down, and contains the bullet.
A great idea, but not perfect. There was still the risk of dangerous hotspots. The latest innovation is called a total containment trap.
Those traps use sheets of steel that are mounted at a very, very steep angle. The idea is, rather than try to stop the bullet, to simply slow it down and redirect it. The angle is such that the bullet never has a chance to dig into the steel. It can't get a bite, and the momentum just carries it to the apex of the trap, and then it's directed into what's called a deceleration chamber, where the bullet then bounces around in a circle, kind of beats the bullet up, and drops it down into a containment basin. Those traps are probably the best solution for containing bullets pretty much intact and keeping stuff from coming back out onto the range.
The total containment trap can handle all types of handguns, rifles, shotguns, armor-piercing rounds, even .50 caliber machine gun rounds.
Ready. Up.
Bullet traps had gone high-tech, but were targets keeping pace? Next, the search for the perfect target and how it changed the firing range. A firing range is crucial to learning how to shoot a weapon with deadly accuracy. But a range is only as good as its targets. So targets began to change from bullseyes to human forms.
Because law enforcement officers are never threatened by bullseyes. Threats generally come from humans. So they would try to replicate a silhouette or a form that would be sized appropriately so that the officer could train in the use of his firearm in directing around properly.
As time evolved, the training tried to get more and more specific as to the real problems that would be encountered by the trainees.
What they were encountering was a new breed of criminal. The machine gun-toting gangster of the late 1920s and early 30s.
This is a 100-shot machine gun used by Ma Baca against a federal man in the raid.
So FBI agents armed themselves with rifles, shotguns, and machine guns, and took to the firing range to learn to shoot them.
Commence firing.
It was one thing to shoot at a fixed target, but most shootouts with gangsters involved car chases, which meant their intended targets were in motion. So FBI agents reasoned that if you're going to hit a moving target, you should at least practice shooting from a moving car. Despite the agents' exceptional shooting skills, innocent people were sometimes getting caught in the crossfire during actual shootouts. So, in an effort to reduce civilian casualties and improve their marksmanship, the FBI decided to add moving targets to their training. During the early 1930s, they developed an innovative firing range known as a Hogan's Alley.
It's a simple plywood facade that represents businesses with doors and windows, and with a system of either levers and pulleys or motors. The range officer could open a door and expose a target, or trip a wire and a target would swing into an opening.
Most of these targets were photos of innocent people engaged in everyday activities. But every so often, a photo of a criminal suspect would appear.
And the officer was expected to react appropriately, draw, engage the bad guy, don't hit the good guy, and continue to move through the course.
Gun! They got guns! Look out!
Considered extremely innovative, the Hogan's Alley is still used today by some police departments. But the Hogan's Alley is only one type of firing range police officers use. Other sophisticated range targets have been developed that can also simulate realism and improve an officer's reaction time. These targets are made of specially treated armor-plated steel, which can stand up to thousands of rounds of bullets. The sound made by a bullet striking steel lets the shooter know instantly when he has scored a direct hit. The steel targets come in various shapes and sizes, from freestanding ones known as pepper poppers, which fall over when struck by a bullet, to small round targets that are electronically wired to a computer. They can be programmed to appear from behind an armored steel plate and then quickly disappear, testing a shooter's reaction time.
Big step! There he
You
is!
can push the shooters to not just get good accuracy, but to get good accuracy in a very narrow time frame.
Even paper targets have improved. from plain black silhouettes to lifelike paintings and photos.
By improving the paper targets and making them look more like the challenge that we're actually up against on the street, it helps not just with the marksmanship training, but also the mindset we try to develop.
Today, there are targets that move, targets that turn, even three-dimensional targets that run.
The controls allow you to start and stop the target, to move it back and forth, and use it to demonstrate to our shooters what it would be like to have someone physically attacking you.
The targets are made of cardboard with openings for balloons. A T-shirt slipped over the target conceals the location of the balloon: head, chest, or lower torso. When a bullet strikes the balloon, it releases a pin, causing the target to come crashing to the ground.
Police, where are you?
Continually striving for a realistic way to shoot at targets, a new type of firing range was developed that borrowed from the World War I House of Horrors. It's known as MATCH, Modular Armored Tactical Combat House. MATCH is a huge improvement over the earlier shoot houses, which were called tire houses. And that's exactly what they were. A maze of tires stacked 8 feet high to represent the inside of a house or building. Functional, but far from real. The MATCH house is made of armor-plated steel. Over the steel is a layer of plywood with a few-inch gap between the two.
When the bullet penetrates the plywood, it hits the steel, the bullet fragments, but all those fragments are now captured and sandwiched between the plywood and the steel. We can put furniture inside our shoot house, make it look like a real-world environment, set targets, hang them from the ceiling, set them on stands in the corner, in the middle of the room.
Some police departments have taken the concept of shoot houses a step further and turned themselves into live targets. Inside this shoot house, cops are firing bullets at each other in the ultimate game of good guys versus bad guys. This is known as force-on-force training.
Force-on-force training is very helpful, where everybody puts on the padded suits and the protective gear and shoots at each other.
The ammunition they're using looks like a real bullet, but it is actually specially manufactured simulated rounds filled with salt or paint.
It's great to have options to include in our training, and because the goal, of course, is to teach people that they can prevail in the environment that we expect them to go into.
Good, excellent.
Terrorist attacks have served to put more law enforcement departments on high alert.
The bad guy to signal to
We
start.
expect that there will be a higher demand for training facilities for those people carrying firearms.
Facilities like Thunder Ranch, which offers a wide variety of real-life environments and challenges.
Stop! Drop the weapon!
Thunder Ranch occupies 2,400 acres outside of San Antonio, Texas. It features firing range attractions with names like the Terminator and the Tower, both of which are elaborate indoor shoot houses.
Stop! Drop the weapon!
And there's the Charger Deck,
which is a contraption that has moving targets that can all be operated independently to attack the shooter.
Their greatest attraction of all is Thunderville, one of the most spectacular Hogan's Alleys in the world. Thunderville is 200 feet long and features over 60 targets.
It's just a very, very innovative, very well thought out training environment where you can learn a number of very worthwhile skills.
Next, it's one thing to sharpen your skills and take target practice with handguns and small firearms. But where does the military go to take target practice? This is target practice military style. It's the crowning achievement in tank firing ranges, and it's located at Fort Irwin, California.
The essence of most training is acquiring a skill. And to keeping that skill, you have to practice.
And the U.S. military has been doing a lot of practice in a lot of places during the past 100 years. But few weapons in the military arsenal have inspired more creativity in the design of its firing ranges than the tank, the workhorse of the U.S. military. The tank has been around since World War I, but it really made its presence felt on the battlefields of World War II.
During World War II, we began to get very interested in tanks. We saw what the Germans did in 1939 with the Blitzkrieg. We realized that tanks were important.
And with that realization came the advent of tank firing ranges. One of the earliest dates from around 1940 at Fort Knox, Kentucky. The target? Old cars.
Let's face it, that's what Americans are great at producing: old, rusted, worn-out car bodies. They make very convenient and useful targets.
Our typical tank target range was about 2,000 meters wide and 5,000 meters deep. Why the extra 3,000 meters in depth?
The other 3,000 meters would have been a buffer zone, so that if they engaged a target at 2,000 meters and they shot over, it wouldn't hit civilians or something else. And that's pretty close to where the size of a lot of ranges that are still used today.
Early tank ranges were not without flaws.
The big problem with the old tank ranges, where you just put car bodies out there or panels, is they're stationary, they're just sitting there, and it's not realistic. That's not the way you would use that tank to engage targets in combat.
So Caswell International came up with the idea of building a plywood tank target.
You cut out a silhouette that either looks like the front of a tank or the side of a tank. Obviously, you don't want to put too many of the side views out there because that doesn't test your gunnery as well as the front view does. If it looks like the front of a tank, you've got a smaller target.
The side view target is 20 feet long, 8 feet high, and weighs almost 400 pounds. The front view target is about half that size. Since most tank target practice involves the use of dummy rounds rather than live ammunition, the target can last a long time.
The largest round that's in use today in the U.S. military is a 120 millimeter diameter round. The targets can withstand maybe 50 or 60 of these rounds before they have to be replaced.
Like law enforcement, the military is constantly striving for realism on its firing ranges. So during the 1950s, Caswell designed a tank target that moves back and forth on railroad tracks, which are laid down behind protective earth berms. It's known as MAT, Moving Armor Target.
Today's Caswell moving armor target system is really an electric car. We think we even beat the auto industry in terms of coming up with a functional electric car. And we also provide it with its own power source. The MAT has got batteries and a generator. As long as you keep fuel in the generator, it'll run continuously for days on end.
Even though blank rounds of ammunition are used, tank target practice still looks and sounds like a real battlefield. That's because MAT has been equipped with special effects that simulate explosions and gunfire.
The special effects on our targets are all designed to put on a show for the trainees and make them feel like they're in real combat.
During the 1960s, Caswell introduced pop-up targets on the tank firing range.
The target is presented to the shooter as the target carrier runs along the railroad tracks protected by a berm, so that when the tank or the armored vehicle is looking at the target, all they really see is the silhouette itself. When the target is struck by a round, then it conceals, indicating to the shooter that he has hit the target.
This is a much more realistic way of training because that's the way it happens in combat. All of a sudden, you see a tank. You can have two tanks pop up at once one near and one far, and see if the crew is smart enough to engage that near target first, because that's the one that's most likely to get you.
Engaging one or two tanks can test any gunner's skills. Imagine trying to take on 1,000. That's how many pop-up tank targets are on the firing range at Fort Irwin, California.
There are no moving targets on that range because it would have been too difficult to put a moving target out there and then have the tank battalion go past it, because remember, it's on a rail, so they would have torn up the rail. Instead, they simulate motion by having a computer scenario that brings targets up in a planned way so that they can simulate either attacking you or going away from you. And with 1,000 of them, they can simulate that pretty well.
The U.S. military has a fleet of more than 7,600 tanks, but tanks are only one weapon of mass destruction in its arsenal. Next, this remote stretch of California desert has been transformed into the world's largest firing range for missiles, rockets, and bombs. A suspicious plane streaks across the California skies. A U.S. fighter jet picks up the enemy plane over the Mojave Desert. The Top Gun pilot locks in on its target and fires a deadly Sidewinder missile. Fortunately, the enemy in this case was just an old U.S. fighter jet that was remote-controlled from a command post miles away.
If the test is successful and goes correctly and the missile behaves as you expect it to behave, you have a very high likelihood for several thousand pounds of F4 to come down and crash in a ball of fire.
Targets going down in flames is a regular sight at the U.S. military's favorite large arms firing range, China Lake, California. Founded in the 1940s and covering more than 1.1 million acres in the Mojave Desert, it's the largest firing range of its kind in the world.
It's a pretty busy place. We run somewhere in the order of 1,000 test missions a year. We have roughly 300 people that work in this department doing testing day in, day out. A small test may have only a half a dozen of those people actually doing something. A larger test will have a couple hundred people involved.
So what type of target practice is going on at this top-secret facility? Everything from Sidewinder air-to-air missiles to Tomahawk sea-to-land cruise missiles to harm and slam air-to-surface missiles. And dozens of other weapons.
We're not just coming in, throwing lots of bombs and firing lots of missiles and having lots of high explosives. The tests that we're doing are very, very closely scripted with very specific goals and objectives.
That's comforting for the people of Southern California, since the China Lake firing range is located just 150 miles from Los Angeles. The military not only owns the 1.1 million acres of desert, but it also controls the airspace from the ground up. It has its own air traffic controllers, monitoring the more than 200 military and commercial flights that pass near China Lake on any given day.
Their primary duty is to keep our internal restricted areas clear of non-participating aircraft, to make sure that if we're firing a missile, it's going to go at the intended target that we want it to go to.
A good idea, since some of the target practice involves cruise and Tomahawk missiles launched from warships and submarines stationed off the coast of California. The missiles are aimed at targets on the China Lake range, but their 200-mile flight path takes them over heavily populated areas. These missiles are capable of leveling small towns, which is why the test team takes extreme measures to ensure that disasters never happen.
The missile is entirely chased with chase aircraft through its entire route. They have the opportunity, if they need to actually take control and fly the missile, or if need be, they can bring the missile down and use the flight termination on the system.
The missiles fly about 1,000 feet off the ground and are constantly monitored by scientists and engineers from this command control center. They too have secret ways of safely destroying a missile if it strays off course. Fortunately, the majority of missiles never deviate from their flight path, and the few that have were destroyed without anyone being hurt. A lot of thought goes into the type of target used at China Lake. It's often influenced by the weapon being tested.
We could have targets that could be built in a day by welding a couple C-vans together, or we have targets that might take 3 or 4 months of construction to work and build to meet the specific requirements of that test. We've also done a lot of work with anti-tank systems such as the Maverick.
A Maverick missile hones in on its target by detecting heat radiating from it.
We bring in tank hulks. They no longer have an engine. We'll actually use charcoal inside the engine compartment to heat them.
The Maverick detects the heat and moves in for the kill. Missiles are also routinely fired at moving targets.
We do have a limited number of tanks that actually remote control from several miles away.
Dune buggies also make great moving targets. Their speed can be varied to match that of any tank or armored vehicle.
And we have people that's what they do for their job, create targets to meet the customer's needs.
And when the customer is Uncle Sam, targets from bridges to bunkers have been built and blown up. Bombs and missiles are crucial in war, but traditional wars are usually won or lost on the ground by soldiers armed with rifles and machine guns. Military firing ranges have come a long way from their earliest days of paper bullseyes on sticks. Just ask any soldier who got stuck with the assignment of retrieving targets.
These people are actually known as butt pullers. The targets were presented by raising them from what was known as a target pit. And at the bottom of the pit, there would actually be humans stationed at each target location who would then mount the target on a device that would elevate it vertically and present the target to the shooter. Once the firing was completed, they'd lower the target and record their score.
Military ranges remained virtually unchanged until the mid-1950s. A surprising study conducted after the Korean War exposed problems in the way soldiers were being trained.
In many instances in the Korean War, the overwhelming majority of a platoon or a company who were engaged in a firefight would not shoot. Only a small number would shoot.
Caswell International, the same company that had created advances in police target ranges and tank target ranges, revolutionized the military rifle range with the creation of an infantry pop-up target.
It will pop up and the soldier will have a certain amount of time to engage it, and if he doesn't engage it, it goes back down. Or if he hits it, then it goes back down and he knows he hit the target.
The targets are hardwired with sensors and cables attached to a control room on the firing range. A trainer can program various ways to train his troops, turning these plastic infantrymen into a new generation of smart targets. In real battles, soldiers don't just move up and down. They also move side to side. So borrowing from the design of their tank target, Caswell incorporated the use of railroad tracks to create the moving infantry target, which could roll back and forth as well as pop up.
We started out just pulling it back and forth at a specific speed, and now we've evolved up to a fully self-contained unit that will go back and forth on the tracks, fire all the simulators of return fire that you might expect from an enemy soldier or a perpetrator.
Caswell has even designed a three-dimensional moving target, which looks like a real person. Shooting at targets, even ones that look like humans, is great for sharpening a soldier's skills. But the best way to prepare for battle is to fire at live targets. Lasers have made it possible. The military uses a system called MILES, Multiple Integrated Laser Engagement System. Receptors are placed on a vest or helmet worn by soldiers. The soldiers are then armed with weapons that fire lasers.
You can then engage those targets just as though you were shooting live fire at them and see who is actually hitting someone and killing them.
When the laser strikes the sensor, it scores a hit.
That is the most realistic force-on-force training anybody's ever had. any army anywhere.
Next, the tiny South Pacific island, which was transformed into a firing range that forever changed the world. The atomic bomb brought an end to World War II, at the same time ushering in an era of nuclear testing. As comedian Bob Hope once said, as soon as the war ended, we located the one spot on Earth that hadn't been touched by the war and blew it to hell. That place was Bikini Atoll, a tiny speck of land in the South Pacific. It would become the world's most famous military firing range.
It was thought that after World War II, there ought to be a test, a Navy test of atomic bombs, and in particular to see how atomic bombs affected ships. You know, would it sink them, destroy them, vaporize them?
Because of its remote location, Bikini Atoll was chosen for that test. In March 1946, the 167 Bikinians who called this tropical paradise home were rounded up by the U.S. Navy and moved to another island. Then a fleet of ships, from aircraft carriers and battleships to destroyers and tugs, were anchored in the nearby lagoon.
The United States actually constructs what becomes the world's fourth largest Navy in terms of number of ships. Well over 150 ships are put in the lagoon.
In the center was the battleship Nevada, the bullseye for the atomic bomb. The project was called Operation Crossroads. And in June of 1946, the same type of bomb used to level Nagasaki was loaded onto a B-29 and dropped onto its awaiting targets.
The atom bomb is in the air on its way to Bikini. All goggles are turned away. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, now.
The nuclear arms race had officially begun. Amazingly, the blast sank only 13 of the 150 ships. In 1952, nearby Anahuac Atoll was the site of the first hydrogen bomb test. As Cold War tensions heated up between the United States and the Soviet Union, the U.S. military wanted a place more private than the Pacific Ocean to carry out their nuclear tests. That place was the Yucca Flats in the Nevada desert.
The first set of tests going out there are called Operation Ranger, and the planes are loaded with atomic bombs at one of the air bases nearby in Nevada, flown up to the test site and dropped on a stationary target.
In some cases, the targets were entire towns, specially constructed for the tests to measure the destructive force of a nuclear warhead.
For a long time, all post-war testing was above ground.
Bomb away.
Approximately 200 tests were carried out above ground, but radiation fallout led to health and environmental concerns, forcing nuclear tests to go underground in the early 1960s.
One of the challenges, major challenges you face, though, is that you're not drilling a little hole, you're drilling a big hole.
Big, as in thousands of feet deep. Unlike above-ground tests where bombs streak towards Earth at hundreds of miles an hour, an underground test requires that a bomb gently reach its target.
How do you drop 100,000 pounds down a hole that's thousands of feet deep? Not drop it, not break it, not bend it, not shake it, and position it right where you want it to be positioned downhole.
Specially designed one-of-a-kind cranes were built to handle the job.
Cranes that can lift 100,000 pounds and drop it inch by inch, very slowly down, very gently down this hole, position it, hold it.
Once in place, the bomb, which was wired with cables and electronic devices for measuring the impact of the blast, was buried under thousands of tons of rock, gravel, and cement, and was finally ready for detonation.
When a nuclear device explodes in the ground, it vaporizes the rock and everything around it, creates a huge cavity underground, but it kind of looks like a moonscape.
The Nevada desert is dotted with dozens of these moon-like craters. Scars of an era that ended with America's last underground test in 1992. The military claims these craters pose no threat of radiation. Taking target practice at a military firing range can be very costly. But a new generation of firing ranges is changing that. They are inexpensive to operate, portable, and can fit in rooms smaller than a basketball court. Like their counterparts in law enforcement, the military has turned to virtual firing ranges for training, using weapons modified with lasers. Many of them, again, provided by FATs.
From pistols through light and heavy machine guns, anti-tank weapons, air defense weapons, armor and anti-armor weapons.
Soldiers can be placed in almost any military conflict imaginable. At the flip of a few computer keys, a trainee can be taking on an armored tank brigade or hunting down guerrilla forces.
The simulators to support ranges are getting smarter every day.
So smart, in fact, that soldiers in different parts of the world can all be linked together to fire at the same virtual enemy.
And the results of one squad can be seen on the screen of another squad.
There's even a new generation of simulators for taking target practice from inside moving vehicles, like boats, jeeps, and tanks. What might tomorrow hold? More realism and more interactivity between the shooter and the target.
Holographs may be an answer to that in the future.
But will holograms and laser simulators ever totally replace live ammunition firing ranges?
You can't do all of your training inside of a room.
People in law enforcement agree.
The video interactive simulators can teach us a lot of good stuff. They're not real bullets.
The Army will always have live fire ranges, but at some point, we're always going to get that tank or that artillery piece or that rifle out there on a range and see how it does and how the crew does or the soldier does with real ammunition. That'll never go away.